So welcome, it's good to see so many friends and interested citizens here tonight. My name is Maurice. I'm the Director of the Bachelor of Arts Media and Communications degree at the university. It's my honour and pleasure to introduce Peter tonight, who's presenting the culmination of his research project into the role of the editor. It's the capstone of his Media and Communications First Decade Fellowship, which celebrates the 10th anniversary of the establishing of a Media and Communications degree here at the university in 2000. I'm especially grateful to the School of Letters, Art and Media and the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences for supporting the concept of a fellowship. Peter has been very busy with us in his role as fellow. The fellowship was anticipated to take a short time in a single block, but it was extended to take in several segments of time on campus. So while he spent 5 weeks with us in total since he started the role in November 2010, working diligently around his Fairfax obligations, he has held the title of Fellow now for most of 2011. And during this period in 2011, he's contributed to, hosted or convened a number of significant events on democracy, the role of the editor, WikiLeaks, all with great grace and humour. Much has been commented about Peter's return to university. Peter tells me his industry mates ask him about it all the time. The fact is that it was a long-term ambition of the department to support a professional in residence because much of the research in the department directly relates to the theory, practice and history of the media. Our desire for the fellowship as well was to expand this research orientation and to encourage public debate about an aspect of the media. I hope we've gone some way to doing that tonight. We had no idea that when we invited Peter into our corridor, how amazingly generous he'd be of his intellect and attention, even with the additional obligations of being publisher. We also, unfortunately, didn't realise his surname was such headline fodder. Editor exits the Fray is particularly memorable. Needs time away from the daily pressures of journalism to think about journalism is a line that stayed with me. It seems as though time researching is seen as an equivalent to a Bex and a good lie down. But this set me thinking, with respect to the business coverage of the media, why not Fray enters the Fray? What about the broader fray of ideas alongside the fray of the media professional? For Peter has done, I believe, a very brave thing for an Australian media executive in admitting that he can benefit from some form of sabbatical practice, some research time. And rather than rest on the common view that the college of experience and leadership in the industry means one has all the knowledge you'll need, Peter has embraced the idea to keep learning, to engage with new ideas and re-engage with some old ones in order to tackle some extremely difficult challenges he faces in his roles. He seems to me then not only to have engaged in an act of personal development and lifelong learning, but an act of public good. I want to keep my remarks to a minimum, but before handing over to Peter, I do want to say that this is an experiment of sorts, as a lot of practice-oriented research is. What follows is not a typical industry stump speech. By the same token, it's not a thesis defence, although I can divulge that taken together, the now much edited writing that leads to this speech amounts, complete with the references, to a small thesis. We all know unexpected things arise from chance corridor and water cooler interactions. We've suggested to Peter lists of readings, contested his thinking, we've supported him with a very able research assistant, Dominic Santangelo. Peter, in his own style, has absorbed much of this reading and discussion, taken on some of ideas, adapted them to create a kind of research-injected speech that's meant to be a contribution to industry and academic discussions. So I speak on behalf of my colleagues in the university in thanking Peter, his family, for sharing such an interesting year and project with us. Without further ado.
Thank you, Stephen. You've been very kind, too kind perhaps. Good evening and thank you for coming. I had first thought of calling tonight's talk The Death of the Editor. And then on a more optimistic note, the future of journalism, we can get there from here. On reflection, the former appeared a tad downbeat and perhaps tempting of fate. The latter belonged to the self-help Anthony Robbins School of Public Speaking. In other words, it wasn't me. So I've chosen the topic of journalist editors and their audiences towards a new compact. Being aware that I could be misinterpreted, I wish to spell out what tonight is and isn't about. It is not my opportunity to join the chorus about the terrible state of journalism and how it was so much better before, back in the golden days. I've been a journalist for 25 years, much of it in senior editorial roles, and it has always been better back then. It's a great shame I missed it. Further, I am not speaking on behalf of Fairfax or the Herald tonight. I speak for myself and on the basis of both my industry experience and my time at Sydney University. And I would like to thank the university, the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences, the School of Letters, Arts and Media, and especially all the staff at the Department of Media and Communications for establishing and supporting the fellowship. I have had a blast. My speech tonight is in 4 sections: the crisis, the roles of journalism, the role of the editor, and the compact. What I will argue for tonight is a new compact between journalists, editors, and their audiences. A compact that at once acknowledges the current trends and pressures faced by the media and points to a healthier future for journalists, editors, and the most important and influential group of all, their audiences. And the key words I want to talk about as part of the new compact are public good, collaboration, diversity, accountability, and transparency. The crisis. First, I want to survey what is widely seen as a crisis of journalism. No one can deny the business model of old media is under siege, and new media, in a fragmented landscape, is not yet at the point of replacing its cash flows. This transition has inspired job cuts, page cuts, and cost cuts, and well-run campaigns to save quality journalism. Some journalists have convinced themselves that the good old days are over. It is up to editors to convince them that they might just be beginning. And that's a hard sell. As the media fragments and revenues leave, the fears grow within and outside the industry that we are seeing the end of days, and bad news sells, and there's lots of it. It's always there, but now it comes faster, daily, hourly, and parcelled up in a nasty email or an anonymous tweet. One view: the media hasn't been doing enough. It's been blinded by spin. It's too cosy with government. The watchdog is more lapdog. Or, as former federal minister cum author Lindsay Tanner has it, the media is guilty of dumbing down society and becoming just another arm of the entertainment industry. Or, as James Fallows puts it, journalists, reporters and editors broke the news by turning complex issues into not much more than an ongoing game show where one person wins, the other loses. All this talk of gloom risks becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy. 4 out of 5 Australian journalists agree or strongly agree the community has a negative perception of them and the work they do. That is an old survey, some 7 years old, but if anything, I suspect the feelings have grown. Certainly most journalists know that there needs to be a new model. The Australian scholars David McKnight and Penny O'Donnell have surveyed 100 senior journalists and editors about how they see the future. Some 87% of them agreed that it was important or very important to find a new business model. Most journalists and editors said they wanted more time and more resources to produce quality journalism, That contentious word again. I will return to it later. A Morgan poll 4 years ago found that 85% of Australians believed newspaper journalists were often biased. 3/4 have said the same about TV journalists and 69% about talkback radio hosts. A more recent study from Essential Research found trust in daily newspapers in Australia down from 62% in 2010 to 53% in July of this year. The perception is something is broken, and that brings up the question of funding for journalism. Will you pay? Will you pay for something you don't actually trust? We've been giving it away for free on the internet, and now we expect you to pay for it. Will you? News Limited will soon find out if that happens by charging content online behind a paywall. Fairfax is also examining new ways to extract revenue from content. The internet and its platforms, like smartphones and tablets, is made for freeloading, is made for aggregation. So how much will you pay? The industry doesn't know, not yet anyway, but one thing is for sure, the primacy of print is well and truly over. Yet print has, up to now, set the news agenda for the day. If you didn't have the stories in the still print-dominant newsrooms of the Herald or Telegraph, morning radio, commercial and ABC would be largely white noise and music. Clearly, as dollars shrink, something has to change. The audience online is growing rapidly. Reporters want to follow their audiences. More people read the Sydney Morning Herald, for instance, now than ever before. The problem, the online/print business model has yet to catch up. I have surveyed the crisis. In a way, that's the easy bit, but what needs to happen next? It's very easy to blame the business model, but I suspect there's something else going on here. The journalism has failed to keep up with needs of society, failed to engage audiences on their own terms, failed, in short, to write what people might want to read. I will go into this in detail later, but there is a valid critique that we have fallen short, that the press has been too transfixed on what it thinks matters to the detriment of its audiences. We probably have preferred the political game show over policy analysis, the personal over the substantial, the voice of the lobby group over the person in the street, and sometimes, though I'd argue not as often as some would have you believe, the personal view of reporters or editors may have clouded objective reportage. We may well have been seduced by public relations and failed to offer a truly smart, independent analysis of events. We may well be guilty of groupthink, and we may have failed by conventional content to give people information which directly affects their lives and assists them to lead better or more informed ones. 15 years ago, James Carey, the renowned US communications scholar, argued the conventions of journalism meant journalists rely on experts, not always of their own choosing, to supply them with causes and consequences. This renders journalists frequent victims of the forces around them rather than defenders of a public interest or common good. I believe this is one of the reasons why so many people think the media is biased. Yet, the irony is the convention of relying on experts or those with a view is designed to deliver balance and neutrality. Carey makes an even more pertinent point. Journalists spend too much time on the what and the who and far too little time on the why. Why is the why so important? There are many functions of the media, but explaining why things happen clearly go to one of the key ones, to assist people to make informed decisions. If journalism fails to do this, preferring to shed more heat than light, clearly it is not doing its job, and the people will go elsewhere for information. And although I promise not to speak from my inside seat, let me say a few things about all of this. It is painful, it is broadly accurate, and yet it is inspirational. It is prompting deep soul searching and reassessment across the industry, from investors to the shop floor. What is journalism for? The current crisis is an opportunity to restate and to reinvent what journalists and editors do and what audiences may want. Journalism is not about one thing, hard news in the name of the public good. There are many other functions, some of which receive scant attention or, in fact, are often derided to the detriment of the audience. Most scholars and editors agree journalism should inform, provide access to public opinion, and investigate the powerful, the traditional watchdog role, and what journalists mean by the term fourth estate. But many see other roles for journalism. How about analysis of events and ideas, advocacy for particular causes or ideas? How about engendering social empathy so we can see the world through the eyes of others? How about entertainment or servicing the economy by bringing the sellers of goods and buyers of goods together via advertising? Or how about maintaining its own financial self-sufficiency so as to be free from special interests? These are all valid roles, though an inordinate amount of time is spent seeing the crisis in journalism through the prism of the press failing its fourth estate functions or its cousin, the public right to know. We would all agree that investigative journalism or political journalism are vitally important to a functioning media and a functioning society. I am not advocating a move away from them. What I am saying is that we need to become more sophisticated and radical about the way we talk about journalism and its roles. As Steve Waldman, the author of a recent and mammoth report on the information needs of communities in the US, asks, do we need professional or citizen reporters? Obviously, we need both. Do we need old media and new media? Both. Objective and advocacy journalism, commercial or non-profit, free or paid, both. In the US, the ProPublica website, which won a Pulitzer this year for investigative reporting, is funded by philanthropic means, donations, and advertising. Dedicated to public good journalism, it makes most of its works available for free to traditional media and actively promotes the good works done by reporters working for it. It has experimented with using amateur or citizen journalists to monitor the work of governments. In Australia, we have our own versions of this expansion of the journalistic field. Two publications to watch: The Conversation, co-founded earlier this year by Andrew Jaspin, and The Global Mail, funded by web entrepreneur Graham Wood and due to launch early next year. But back to what journalism is for. 15 years ago, in his influential book, Breaking the News, Fallows argued that the news industry had to re-embrace its special role as a business that was not just about being a business. 15 years on, there are reasons to be optimistic that new lands are in sight, even if we are still testing our navigational skills. We are still in uncharted waters, but maybe that's okay. As Fallows himself recently said, as technological, commercial, and cultural changes have repeatedly transformed journalism, they have always caused problems that didn't exist before, as well as creating opportunities that often took years to be fully recognized. Journalism is not just one thing. A more academic way to say this is that we need to explore alternatives to what American scholar Barbie Zelizer calls the unitary model of journalism. That is, journalism that only links the media's public good functions to the provision of hard news. Arguably, newspapers have been following Zelizer's advice for years. We have published supplements aplenty on all kinds of topics, but we are also guilty, as charged, of thinking of journalism as only hard news. One useful word here is genre. Megan Lemesurier and Fiona Giles from Sydney University argue that hard news journalism has been conflated to mean journalism itself, whereas other genres of journalism are quarantined by the use of descriptors such as fashion, travel, food, and that wonderful catch-all, lifestyle. The upside to the genre idea, in asking again what is journalism for, is that it broadens the possible. It allows us to connect to multiple audiences and adds depth and breadth to journalism. Part of any new compact requires a redefinition of what is news and how it should be written. This will become more compelling as different forms of journalism are delivered to different people using different devices. Is the tweet, for example, a new genre? To which I'd say yes, in a new sense, but that depends on what it says. Now, can I explain in 140 characters? And the beautiful thing about the world in which we live is it may be possible, with some judicious editing and brave thinking, to keep everyone happy, the traditionalists and their would-be usurpers. One of the most pressing questions for journalists, editors and their audiences is, what is quality journalism? Quality is often seen as a cipher for rationality and objectivity, implying distance and detachment. Yet, one of the reasons the media is considered to be in such a poor odour is the distance it has from the people it seeks to engage. There is also a tendency, understandable as it may be, to only see quality in terms of the hard news watchdog role of the press. And yet, as I have discussed, there are many genres of journalism. Journalists and editors like the word quality. Who wouldn't want to do quality work? But personally, I find the term quality an intellectual roundabout, and I would prefer to talk about independence. Quite simply, quality doesn't help us understand the multiple functions of journalism. We need to embrace a wider range of genres under this idea and look for quality in everything we do. The role of the editor. What really got me going on the role of the editor was the content farm, a US invention that sees an army of freelancers paid to write stories based on and in response to hits on Google and other search engines. In other words, what the audience is looking for. This is editing by search engine optimization. These stories are then loaded onto websites to drive traffic. It is a virtuous circle, if you like. The public want to see certain stuff, they go looking for it, and hey presto, the content farms give it to them. As I said, who then needs editors stumbling about trying to decide what the public might want, or more to the point, should want? One of the obvious answers is that editors do much, much more than decide what goes on in a paper. They are the embodiment of an organization's culture and values. That is why the News of the World editors should have known what was going on with the phone hacking. That is why editors and editors-in-chief are valid subjects of public discourse. Editors set the tone, and in these fragmented days, editors need to be thought of as more than captains of objectivity trawling about in a sea of supposed facts of equal worth. In my reading about what has concerned other editors over the years, there is scant debate about what editors actually do. When editors talk out, they really reflect on their own roles, views and ethics, preferring to use the opportunity to critique their industry. Perhaps editors don't think, they just do. Tonight I'm going to break for cover, and I'd like to suggest the work of an editor can be captured in a few subheadings: culture, representation and presentation. Culture. Editors do not live in a cultural vacuum. They bring their own experiences and life views to the job. They bring their own values and judgments, but they also reflect the culture of the media, its many roles, and the innate aspects of their own mastheads. They are custodians of the codes of ethics and the mechanisms that are designed to assure a high degree of accountability and transparency. They need to be free from board or outside control and need to stay vigilant to remain so, all the while reflecting in their actions their organization's corporate and intellectual values. This needs to happen especially during periods of painful cultural, industrial, technological readjustment. Editors influence everything they touch, and it shows. They need to bring to the job a deep sense of commitment to their journalists and audiences and respect for their views. They need to inspire and cajole. They need to earn trust and show that they are worthy of it. In our digital world, they now have more opinions to deal with than ever before. They need to make judgment calls about them. They have to lead, and that is becoming harder. We have come a long way from the founding 18th and 19th century ideals of the free press, as expressed in Europe and North America and adopted by use here. As political scientist John Keane notes, the free press was assumed to be a vehicle for rational knowledge. Such knowledge would expose and dissolve irrationality everywhere. Clearly, this is not how the media now operates, if it ever did. Some editors stand accused of being purveyors of irrationality, but the question of rationality and adherence to an objective style of reporting brings up some constant and awkward challenges for editors, not least of which is what counts as a fact. Is President Obama a US citizen? What an absurd debate. Is climate change real or not? Is a price on carbon a tax? Was Osama bin Laden brought to justice or assassinated? As the late US Senator Daniel Moynihan said, everyone is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. Representation and presentation. Much of what editors do is functional, driven by deadlines and concerns, the dual roles of what can be termed representation and presentation, twin functions of the daily art, or was that science of editing? The question is always what to cover and how to display it. This may all seem a bit so what, but think about it for a moment, and both decisions make a profound statement about how a paper, a website, or a broadcast finds its audiences and goes some way or another to meeting their needs. By representation, I mean the political nature of the editor's role, the many decisions which revolve around the daily agenda of what to put in the paper, website, or broadcast, the determination of what stories are deemed to be more important than others, and what to write in the editorial. Editors are both representatives of democracy, unelected as they may well be, and vessels for its discontents. They harness the considerable resources and intellectual capital of themselves and the journalists who work for them to deliver a running critique on Parliament at work. We lionize its ideals and lament its failings, and we editorialize about both. Thus, we seek to represent the public by having our best guess based on years of experience and what we think we know people are interested in. We both watch and participate. We act on instinct and draw on cherished principles. We make a series of calls by the minute as to how we should best represent the views of the public. We strive to see the difference between what is important and what is urgent, though I fear we often conflate the two, spending more time on the sizzle of public life than the sausage of public policy. The danger here is that editors and their journalists working as representatives of the people are kept out of the deep waters and away from the real decision makers. People who have been inside government and then return to the media world are often amazed about how little journalists know and how little access they actually have. We may well want to be on the outside looking in, as are our audiences, but without knowledge, what are we talking about? What should we ask? And how do we set a relevant agenda? It is perhaps too easy to complain that journalists are victims of a vast machine dedicated to spin and obfuscation. Many journalists are adept at finding ways to negotiate through this maze and know how to develop trust and access. But what we, editors and journalists, most urgently need to do is recast our efforts to go deeper and longer, to have the patience and the aptitude to report deep and long. We must also have the confidence to set up, develop and articulate our own views on behalf of the citizens we aspire to represent. There is another important aspect of what editors do. They have a presentational role. By presentational, I mean the look and feel, the page one design, the size and shape of the picture, the way the graphics and the data are used. To my mind, the look is almost as important as the content and can certainly make the difference of tone and accessibility to readers. Barely a week goes by when I am not asked when the Sydney Morning Herald will go tabloid. There's nothing wrong with the question, and I appreciate most people who ask are motivated by genuine interest and care about the paper. Going tabloid is an important presentational and commercial question, and one that, if badly executed, if it were to go ahead, could harm the paper's standing. Here is another example of the presentational role. In the course of developing the Sydney Morning Herald iPad app, as much editorial time was spent on how the app would look and function as what would be on it. Given most tablet media apps repurpose content already made elsewhere, with the addition of platform-specific content such as picture galleries and videos, it may be reasonable to see the editor more as curator. Curating is not just about selecting, but is less concerned with the creation than the traditional editorial top-down model. As we move deeper and deeper into the digital age, editors are going to become more like curators, people who make multiple decisions about what goes where rather than what should be created. Does this mean I will become curator-in-chief? 10 years ago, John Hartley, professor at QUT, asked whether it is possible to tell a society by how it edits. Can a period be identified by how it brings matter into a certain form? Are we in a period where it is not information, knowledge, or culture as such that determine the age, but how they are handled? For Hartley, we are living in a redactional society where information is constantly reduced, revised, prepared, published, edited, adapted, shortened, abridged, to produce in turn the news. So, perhaps some of us will become redactors-in-chief. Hartley's prescient views are a challenge to both the traditional presentational and representational aspects of the editor's role. As he says, even as its representative democratic function is superseded, journalism itself massively expands. I take this to mean that everyone can be an editor, but I don't think it means the editor is dead. Indeed, this expansion of democratic voices makes the role even more important. The representative role of the editor, I'd argue, is not superseded, far, far from it. In my various editorships, I have pushed for freedom of an alleged terrorist, floated changing the New South Wales Constitution to allow recall elections, and published, with the help from many others, an independent blueprint for the new transport policy for Sydney, a job which we, as taxpayers, pay MPs and bureaucrats to do. While I did not use the term myself, these are examples of civic journalism. Journalism that the objective method militates against. Journalism that aims to provoke conversation. In a choice between objective and civic, I'd plump for the latter when the public consensus needs to be recognised or shifted. This is the power of the editor. It is a power way beyond curation. It's based on personal judgment, yes, of course, but also on principles of justice and a fair go. Fundamentally, it is about leadership. David Hicks, an Australian citizen, was held in prison for 5 years without trial. The New South Wales Constitution should allow citizens the right to recall moribund and dysfunctional governments. Successive New South Wales governments had failed to deliver an effective transport system. Tell me if I'm wrong, but is it time to campaign to bring the troops out of Afghanistan? As Jay Rosen, the doyen of public journalism in the US, says, in the old theory, credibility flows from detachment and distance. You're credible because you're not involved. Under the new theory of credibility, credibility follows because you are concerned, because you care, because it matters to you what happens in the community. In many, many ways, this is not a radical statement. It is what local papers have been doing forever, showing that they care about the local community. And I'm often struck by what appears to be a double standard here. Local papers are expected to be intrinsically linked to their communities and take a leadership role on an important local issue. For this, they are awarded and celebrated. National or metro papers, however, are more likely to be criticised for taking overt positions, as if in doing so they are trading off objectivity and pandering to the crowd or parts thereof. For metropolitan editors, the challenge is when and how to do it. Any new compact between editors, journalists and audiences will need editors capable of mustering all their traditional skills and roles, presentational, representational, and cultural, and learning new ones. Perhaps the most important of these is how to listen. New challenges to the very fabric of democracy arrive every day. As the political scientist Simon Tormé points out, there is a skepticism around representation. There are many people out there who don't want to be represented per se by anyone or anything. They just want to be heard. The new compact. You've been very patient. That's it. Oh, no, you've been very patient. As you can gather, I don't believe that everything is broken, but I do believe we need a new way of thinking, a new compact. The key terms are 1, the public good, 2, collaboration, 3, diversity, 4, accountability and transparency. Number 1, the media must constantly expand its public good role and accept change. In order to thrive, the media needs to spend more time contributing ideas, shedding more light than heat. There are other modes or genres it can and should work in. It must assert the rational over the irrational. The media has to be more than a sideshow. It is at a point of transformation, and from that point, there needs to flow a redefinition of quality or independent journalism. Audiences, note the plural, deserve and want better journalism. The very styles of journalism need to change. There is no one-size-fits-all. One of my pet hates, as I've said before, is the inverted pyramid. This is a style used to construct news stories by ranking in descending order different and competing voices. Its aims are noble and expedient, to render the complicated simpler, the abstract concrete. But what it also does is codify conflict and makes it harder to reveal and explain, harder to find the why. In doing so, it excludes the great mass of citizens who can't be bothered to decode what the hell the journalists are on about. It disempowers the audience, again, the very opposite of what journalism should be trying to do. It can also take away from the pleasure of reading good writing. For me, even though it happened a couple of years ago, David Marr's piece on a hole in the road in Bellevue Hill remains an exemplar. It starts, as catastrophes go, the great Bellevue Hill landslip was extremely civilized. The only reported casualties are 2 cars, a lamppost, and a tree. The horse trough in Victoria Road survived in situ. Nothing inverted about that. There are flaws and limitations in some of the key concepts used to describe the functions of the press. Phrases like the Fourth Estate and the public right to know. I would argue for a new approach to reporting political discourse. We need to reinvigorate those watchdog functions. Journalism can and should report, campaign, advocate, investigate, reveal, analyse, explain and entertain. It will be driven by ideas and be full of surprises. But it can't do all of them on every platform, neither should it want to. Indeed, old and new media can and must live together and learn from each other to deliver better democratic outcomes. In fact, I will argue that over time, near time perhaps, we will need to work to abandon the distinction between old and new. 2, that it must collaborate with other agents of democracy and not just other media, and accept that while journalism sits at the forefront of the public conversation, it is not the only conversation. Central to the new compact is how journalists and editors relate to their audiences. And to achieve this, the future of journalism must be collaborative with other media, traditional and non-traditional, like WikiLeaks, but especially with audiences. This can mean working with startups or enlisting its own pro-am forces of citizen journalists to tap into public opinion or monitor the actions of governments. The media will continue to be an agent of democracy, but when millions of people have the tools to spread mass opinions and hold institutions to account, its preeminence is compromised. Is this a bad thing? We only have to start to tap into the potential for citizen journalists to work with traditional media. The immediate challenge for editors is, as US scholar Michael Schudson says, to turn the current moment of transformation into a reconstruction, enabling independent reporting to emerge enlivened and enlarged. Number 3, that diversity and pluralism of platforms and tools should lead to greater diversity of content and voice. Editors need to understand, if they do not already, that journalism will be performed across multiple platforms and in doing so reach multiple audiences. There is no doubt that the platforms they edit, print, website, tablet and so on, will require constant reformation. I firmly believe that the web is the place for breaking news, the paper the place for thinking news, focused around unique, ideas-driven content, and the tablet experience rests somewhere between, making full use of its inherent capacities to deliver a lean-forward, visually rich experience. In future, I see newspapers spending more time on investigations, analysis, and different ways to present information away from the conflict-focused inverted pyramid. They will certainly need better copy and more nuanced editing. I see the web breaking the news and views and offering a far richer and interactive experience. As curators, editors need not be slaves to repurposing content. They will still be agenda setters, but they would be foolish to ignore the nuances of platforms and the needs of audiences seeking different information at different times of the day. What is abundantly clear in the age of Twitter, Facebook, Google, and the blogosphere is that the agenda can no longer be solely defined by a self-appointed elite, which includes, obviously, myself. Number 4, that better accountability and transparency are crucial to reforming the trust relationship with the audience. I note The Guardian in Britain has recently taken this literally and is publishing part of its news list, the usual secretive litany of the day's stories, on a live daily blog. People are being encouraged to get in touch with editors and reporters if they have ideas or information about the stories. It is a trial, and as The Guardian admits, it has no idea how successful it will be, but it is fascinating. It is a fascinating iteration of two key elements of any new compact: transparency and collaboration. No media company in Australia has come close to such openness, and there is a small voice in my head saying that's just the sort of thing those lefties at The Guardian would do. But it is impossible to deny the potential for such an idea to change the nature of the relationship between media and its audiences and produce better journalism into the bargain. My own modest contribution to the cause of demystifying the media has been, as I say, far more modest, and I must confess, a steal from an ideal used at The Guardian and The Observer and The New York Times. The reader's editor of the Sydney Morning Herald and the Sun Herald is tasked in part to explain how those papers and websites make decisions. It may still be too early to say whether the position held by Judy Prisk will elevate debate beyond a cacophony of complaint, or whether it will fundamentally change the nature of the relationship between Fairfax mastheads in Sydney and its readers, or the type of journalism they produce. But if little else, the reader's editor has already reinforced in my mind that we do have to do more to reveal the processes behind the mastheads. We do need to explain how we are held to account and what happens when we fail, and we do have to show the public more about how we make that sausage. That ain't always pretty, but it's more and more necessary for a new compact if it's going to take hold. I should say that every day I see credible, courageous and important decisions being made by journalists and editors. And yet the federal government feels an inquiry is needed to work out how to improve press accountability. There are hundreds of restrictions on the actions of the press in this country, not to mention a wealth of internal and external codes that set out to define media values, ethics, and correct practices. So, do we need a media inquiry? What I will just say is that every editor I know is aware of what responsible behaviour is in the media and what it isn't. What we definitely do need is greater effort to explain to the public what happens on the editorial floor and to open the doors on ourselves. a conclusion. Editors need to lead these changes, and now is the time for leadership. The salvation and reinvention of the media is in its own hands, as is its damnation. There is no doubt that the products of the media are changing and will continue to evolve. Journalism is more fluid, or liquid, as Mark Deuser calls it, than ever before. And fluid journalism needs solid editors. Editors who are able to lead and listen and make informed, brave, and at times risky choices about what is done and not done, about what goes where and why, and how all these things fit together. I also see greater emphasis on using the web as a place where audiences not only interact, but shape the content of the journalistic agenda. This idea extends beyond the current fascination with moderation of comments to using the citizens as a journalism resource, as I've discussed. Editors will be more than curators or redactors of other people's ideas. They will still shape up those ideas and, informed by the citizens, use the wealth of data available to make those ideas come alive. Representation remains at the forefront of the editor's role, but they will have to acknowledge in thought and deed the inherent difficulty of claiming to speak on behalf of or for the people. Nevertheless, we should set ourselves goals. Some examples: we should campaign to end the shocking disparity between levels of Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal health and literacy outcomes. We need to lead a rational debate, note the word rational, about Australia becoming a republic. We need to lead the debate about the full ramifications of our ageing population and how the ideal of a fair go sits with thousands of Australians living in poverty, many of them elderly women. What is that goal? What is the goal? I say it should be measurable change. Journalism needs, when appropriate, to do more than simply point out the problem and observe what happens next. We need to be mindful of the many roles of journalism and its many genres. We need to examine any new way possible to listen to audiences, not just their comments, but their ideas. It is fashionable to talk about the death of journalism, or in my world, the death of newspapers. I hope tonight I have shown that predictions of demise are both premature and immature. The media world is a very different place than it was 25 years ago when I started out, different than a decade ago, different than last year even. It is a challenging and scary and yet exciting and reinvigorating time and place. I have every confidence that a new compact between journalists, editors and audiences can and will be found. Frankly, it must. I thank you for your time.
So we've come to that point in the evening where you can ask some questions of Peter. Just if you could identify yourselves as you speak, as this is being podcast and filmed by APAC, that would be great. Just by way of a very quick recap, I appreciated your informed look at the crisis and role of the media, your very candid and frank take on the role of the editor, especially in terms of the cultural dimension, the representational aspect and the presentational aspect, and your positive take and vision for that role in the form of a new compact to do with the public good, collaboration, diversity and transparency. So questions, please.
Peter Richard Maurice from News Media, Media and Communications. Look, that was a most inspiring and objective and impartial discussion and speech you've just given us. I hesitate to make a comment because you're in a particular position and can't really made too much comment, although I expect that we don't have too much media that's going to come out of tonight because we've got President Obama capturing all the media in Canberra. But my observation to you is this: as an informed reader of the Sydney Morning Herald, I find it the most inspiring and objective newspaper that gives me the truth. Recently, I think it was David Mail, Robert Mann in the Australian Quarterly, Sydney Quarterly, that made a very forensic dissection of the bias in the Murdoch press. What worries me is that, and it's something you haven't covered for all the reasons that I've mentioned, what worries me and many of my colleagues and many thinking Australians very much is that I think 70% of the print media in Australia is owned by Murdoch. And we see the same editorial bias in those newspapers. And that's why, not your diplomatic observation, Julie Gillard, the government is going to have an inquiry. It's really an inquiry inspired by, initiated by, the unrelenting, and I say corrupt, bias in the Murdoch press against the Labor government. And I'm not taking sides for the Labor government, there's plenty to criticise them about. Do you have any comment at all?
I should parlay some of those wonderful comments about the Sydney Morning Herald to the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald, Amanda Wilson, who's sitting here on my right, my good friend and colleague. My response to that one broadly around the Oz and News Limited is, if you don't like it, don't buy it. And I know that's a pretty quick, trite line. Well, not in this city they don't. And actually, if you live in Brisbane or Perth or elsewhere, you can access, well, you can go on the web and read whatever you like in the world, as we all know. So I think this media inquiry is a particular beast, and I have real problems that the media inquiry is framed up as a sort of anti-Murdoch thing. Look, there was a massive problem, remains a massive problem in the UK. We're finding out new and horrendous things about what's gone on there every day. The fact that that has been parlayed by the federal Labor government and the Greens into the media inquiry, I find troubling, and I appeared before the media inquiry today and said, well, we didn't really actually say that much. It was a very pleasant experience, funny enough. But I think things change. The Murdoch press evolves. It clearly has taken a stance, an anti-Labor stance. It has clearly had an agenda. If they're entitled to have their agenda, is my view. I mean, maybe that's a kind of namby-pamby kind of, you would say that kind of editor-in-chief type of position. But frankly, as I say, if you don't like it, don't buy it.
Hi, I'm Sharon Prince, and until about a month ago I was a staff for Republica, and I've just come to join the Globe Mail. So
This is an ad, isn't it? Right.
No, but I was having some trouble containing myself when you mentioned my two organisations. But I guess because of that, I was surprised to hear you say that you see newspapers as the place for long form, sort of the step back analysis, and the web for breaking news, because of course that's the exact opposite of what Republica does. I'd just like to hear you talk a little bit more about your reason for making that distinction. It's not the way I consume media, so.
Sure. And I don't think I've got the 100% of the answers here, but I do think that, especially over the weekend, that the printed product remains a place where you can sort of, enjoy it, relax into it, and it becomes more of a, and I hasten to, I'm a bit reluctant to say a magazine experience. If you look at how people use the web, especially in the Monday to Friday, a lot of people just use the web to grab bits. And I mean, maybe that's a different experience. And maybe, ProPublica has shown that it can work in the web. Of course, there's nothing to compare it with in the ProPublica sense, because you never had a newspaper. So my personal view, and I think the stats show this, is that the accessing the web during the day, during the workaday for a mass audience is pretty well breaking news, breaking views, bites, stuff, video, those sorts of things. and where's the future for newspapers? I really don't see that newspapers have a future if it starts just repeating what happened yesterday. I mean, Amanda and I talk about this all the time, that, you know, we will kill newspapers if we just do what happened yesterday. And that's where that question around the why, and I do think that the newspaper remains this wonderful portable thing to get into some depth and analysis. And I look forward to seeing your work on the Global Mail.
Thanks, Stephen, and thanks very much, Peter, for your very interesting speech. My name is Lynch. I'm Director of the Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies here. I spent a few years working as a political correspondent in London, and my passion stems from that. There were times when we were gripped by a sense that we ought to hunt in a pack when particular stories were running. It didn't always shed more light and heat. You know, we had to go after the personal peccadillos of Conservative MPs in the John Major era, for example. But we also, once we sank our teeth into the British government's cover-up over weapons of mass destruction, we made sure we didn't let go. So it did have its uses. And what I find curious sometimes is what I experience as a failure by Australian journalism to follow up quite quickly on each other's stories. There's a story that I remember the paper broke a couple of years back, where you obtained under freedom of information confirmation from a senior public servant that he advised the relevant Department of the State Government that the desalination plant was not needed. I switched on ABC 702, in the bulletins in subsequent hours and days, almost rubbed my ears to find that there was no mention of it. And then last week, for example, the New Matilda website broke the story of the Serco contract, which we've all speculated about for all this time. And if I may say so, I opened the Herald the next day and was similarly surprised to find no mention of that. Now, you and I both know how much digging out those stories require. Is there something about Australian journalism that holds Australian journalists back from that kind of pack hunting phenomenon?
Well, I think your critique is exceedingly valid. And it may well speak something of the nature of the lack of, goes back to Richard's question as well, I think, about the lack of diversity in the media. And I'm all in favour of diversity. I see no reason why, and that was a very good story by New Matilda, by the way, that we shouldn't have followed that up. I have no reason, I have no idea why 702 didn't follow up that. Excellent. Richard, do you have any idea about that?
Can we concentrate on a man?
Yeah, I think it's a very, very valid thing. You know, I think we're coming from a long way back on this one, which is to say that, you know, there is a tendency at the Herald to be a little bit, you know, in Mount Herald. You know, it's a lofty, nice place to be, and we all love it, and for that reason. And perhaps we don't pay enough attention to what happens elsewhere, partly because it means that we have to pay attention to what, you know, the Murdoch press is writing. And so there's a kind of professional pride thing there. And I agree with you, and it's an interesting thing. You mentioned the weapons of mass destruction. I was the European correspondent for the Herald when the first report came out, and en masse, virtually everyone said, you know, we're 45 minutes away from, you know, weapons blowing up. Where was it? Some island in Greece or something? Cyprus, that's right, Cyprus. And you know, the media went nuts, and everyone followed that for a few days, and then the media got really pissed off when, of course, it realised it'd been duped, and then it went completely the other way. So there is a power in that. Although I think, you know, if you want a more intelligent critique of that, we should have probably gone our own ways in the first instance. I personally remember sitting in my flat in London in my pajamas, filing from that report to make sure it got into the Herald, you know, because of the time difference. And thinking, oh my God, you know, I've got to trust the government. And I did, and I was wrong. So I think you make a valid point. You're not going to defend 702, are you?
Peter, very interesting talk. I'm a journalist I've worked in mostly print media in Australia and Europe, and also both sides of the fence. I've worked in government, overseas, public affairs, etc. My question is a little complex, perhaps. It relates to the role of the journalist, who appears to me, from personal experience, what I've observed, to be very much a multitasking role. For example, you can be editor of a magazine, I'm not going to mention that particular magazine, but we're also involved in the marketing, the organising of conferences, the awards, ceremonies, etc., as well as all the editing, the rest of it. My experiences, particularly more so perhaps late, is they're under a great deal more pressure than they used to be. The investigative journalists, for instance, I've found out in Canada and the US, there's a particular role that a journalist will have. An investigative journalist, he or she is particularly geared to that role. They don't do anything else. And I'm just wondering, with your new ideas and your compact, etc., what happens with all this pressure on the journalists? What more do they take on?
That's a very valid question too. You know, I think what we need to do, and there's a few hints in the speech I think about this, is we will not be doing all things on all platforms all the time. So there will be more greater, at one level there'll be greater specialization. So I think there will be teams of people, teams of reporters dedicated to breaking news, and there will be expanded teams dedicated to investigations, and there may well be things that we don't do. Or that we do them in collaboration with other forces. You know, the Global Mail, for instance, has already sort of vaguely had a chat with us about doing some work with them, and the conversation, and, you know, would love to do stuff with us. I mean, you know, in a way, I'm up for anything that expands the kind of the diversity and collaborative kind of thing. So I think there's that element to it. I do think I don't want to see in journalists, you know, feeling that they've got to do a gazillion things and work 15 hours a day. I just don't think there's any long-term future in that. You know, come into work 8 hours, go home. But yeah, that's right. That's right. Here's my speech. Yeah. But no, I'm afraid you and I are going to work 15 hours a day for the rest of our lives. But so no, I agree. There's also quite a lot of, and there's a reasonable debate about marketing and, you know, those sorts of, if you like, things at the side. I think, and I do a lot of that, and Amanda does a lot of that. You know, sometimes I prefer not to do as much of that as we do, but it's part of selling the message. I mean, I think we are living in this age where we are a bit anxious, and we kind of work out, well, you know, how do we need to do that, because that might equal, oh, well, good thing. So we sort of do risk compromising ourselves a little bit, I agree. And so it is perhaps time to step back, half a step back, and look at it. One of the positive things, and I'm speaking mainly about the Herald here, but we have had for the last 5 years or so a kind of separate, the digital space has been different from the print people, and they've been this kind of couple of camps, and that's falling apart now as we speak, and that can only be a good thing.
Etymologically, the word lead is interlinked to the word educare in Latin, to lead. Do you think that there's a role, for example, vis-a-vis desperate public transport reform, the need for improvement of dysfunctional government mismanagement of public transport? Do you think there's a need for the media to educate the public about the interrelatedness of environmental issues, climate change, the climate change crisis, and dysfunction in areas like public transport management? Yeah,
the short answer is yes, and the longer answer is that it goes a little bit back to the lady from ProPublica / Global Mail, that I think if we need to step back and have a look at what we use, say, print products for, and one of those things is to have a more nuanced, deeper debate and to connect, you know, things that, as you're talking about with you know, bigger, you know, when we did the public transport inquiry, we employed Ron Christie, who was the guy who got the trains running in Sydney for the Olympics, and he went away and had his own little team. We weren't involved with him, and we told him to go and do it. Just go and if you look at his report, he did have a very nuanced view of that, and we published a 16-page report on their report. We basically published their report, and I think that's kind of one of the really, you know, meaty ways that. And you can do it across platforms, it's not just a print thing. So we should be doing more of that, I agree.
I'm Richard Lover. I love what you said about light and heat and the need to bring more light and heat. But what do you do in this environment where you can see the number of hits all the time? I guess on radio you can see the number of SMSs, and on dsmh.com you can see the number of hits. When people seem to want heat rather than light, how do you keep your own head?
Well, you do it, Richard. You know, I think there's a balance as ever, isn't there? There's a balance that you take information, and I have made a strong case tonight, I think, for listening to the audiences far greater than we do. And I think that can be extended, and I think radio does exceedingly well. And I'm not going to blow smoke anywhere near you, but I do think that a good radio broadcaster is fully aware of their audience. A great editor is fully aware of their audience, and has a kind of perhaps an instinctive feel, and that where the gut thing comes in. I don't think we can only sit around though and do what exactly the audiences want. I think we need to engage and challenge and provoke and lead those audiences, and I think we, I don't know if we get that right all the time. And there's also the way you do it. Lady Gaga comes to Sydney, and if you like, the FM radio stations will be full of Lady Gaga. Lady Gaga comes to Sydney in 702, or the Herald actually might write something sort of, dare I use the word, because it's a very elitist word, intelligent about Lady Gaga, or what she means, or the other angles that she throws up. That's another way of engaging the same issue. Not that we're ignoring Lady Gaga, but we're actually, she's a very interesting person. So I think the other thing about the digital space is that we do have all this information, and we need to find a way of filtering it and engaging with that. So that's why I like the concept of the pro-am kind of citizen journalist. I mean, wouldn't it be powerful if you said to your listeners, go and do X and come back to me? Or if we did the same, go and, one of the things that I keep giving them a mention, but the ProPublica people did was to have something like 500-600 citizen journalists to go and monitor what government spending in various cities in the US. That's powerful stuff, right? Powerful stuff. And that's kind of much more interesting than just a bunch of, feedback noise.
Thanks, Peter. Theodore L. from the Department of Botany here at the University. I can only reiterate the praise you've been given for your talk. I think it was extremely insightful and uplifting. I'd like to ask you a question about genre. You mentioned a very lovely phrase in your book, which is the pleasure of good writing. And I'd like to ask about the genre of literary journalism. You may know that the Australian Literary Review recently ceased production. And in some of the major newspapers, the literature sections are buried deep beneath lifestyle, followed by twice as many pages of theatre listings and cinema listings. And what's in them is many, many book reviews, but very rarely a reflection on new trends in poetry, new trends in fiction. A lot of talk about, say, prizes and all the competitions. I'd just like to ask, do you think, how much room is there for the imagination, news about imagination, alongside news of the rest of the world?
Yeah, great question. A few things to say on that. I am guilty. You have me, banged up. About a month ago, I took the poetry pages out of the Sunday paper. I'm guilty. And I went and interviewed someone for the course of this talk, who turned out to be a guy called John B. Fairfax. And the first thing he said to me is, why did you take the fucking poetry prizes out of the Herald? I said, why? Why do you care? And he said, well, I actually supported this group called the Red Room, which actually ran the poetry. There is enormous interest out there, and it pops up and bites you on the bum at all sorts of places. I think we have reached probably a point where we've cut as many pages out of certain parts of the paper as we should. I think the Monday to Friday newspaper is probably going to stay more or less like it is, but if anything, I'd like to increase the content and the amount of pages in the weekend papers. I think you look at something like Good Weekend. Well, it isn't that long ago that Good Weekend actually did some literary fiction in there, but now if it's only 32 or whatever it is, 38, 36 pages, you can't do it. And I agree with you. And it was a great shame the literary review closed. And if you're anything to do with it, I'm happy to talk with you later. No, you're not. Okay. And the other thing is that we need to take more risk. You know, one of the things, and I think this hopefully comes up in the speech, is that there is no reason why once in a while we shouldn't run literary journalism off the front of the paper. If we are going to challenge, you know, people, and we're going to challenge how they, you know, use something like a newspaper, we should not just have, you know, cute 420-word stories by David Meyer about a hole in the road in Bellevue Hill. We should actually engage in a more intellectual way, and you do see that happening. It happens, you know, a lot in Europe, and it happens quite a lot in odd places like Brazil. There's a really thriving sort of way of using the journalism that way. I really think that's kind of, again, going back to what print does against what the web does. I think that's kind of where the print thing is going to go. But I suspect that's more on the weekend. We're in the process at the moment of trying to reimagine the Sunday paper, and you know, we're sort of heading that way. I mean, I'm not sure if we're going to get all the way that would keep you happy, but we're heading that way.
Any more questions?
Peter, great speech. Enjoyed very much your, I suppose, the welcome focus on accountability and transparency for journalism. My name's Fiona Martin, I work with media and communications, and I wrote about transparency for the conversation just last week. What's the incentive for citizen journalism, or citizen journalists to be involved with the Herald? How are you going to make it, you know, a worthwhile proposition for lots of people to get involved in researching stories?
Yeah, good question. I think we need to go and try it first. I think we talk a lot about things like this and don't do them. And the first thing we need to do, I will be, I'm sure, pleasantly surprised when we actually go out and do it, and we'll get overwhelmed. If I look, going back to the readers editor, Judy Prisk has been overwhelmed with the feedback and emails and everything, and people desperate to know. And I think that's been a lot of what people say about, say, the Herald is pretty robust, but it does show that a lot of people really care. And I think it's the way you approach the citizen journalist question. So I think I think our role in that is define what we want to find out. So the first step, what is it we want to do? So it can't just be, hey, you know, we love you, you should love us a bit more, you know, come on, have a hug. It really needs to be about, we want to do this thing, and this is the goal, and we want to enlist you to do that. And that's sort of what's happened as you know, elsewhere. If people, you know, a year or so ago, in fact, when I started doing the fellowship, there was I had a series of conversations, because I did actually think for a little while of turning this whole thing into, as you know, into a kind of what would Sydney be like without the Herald kind of thing. And the more I looked at it, the more scared I got. But also, it's very hard to do. But also, I'm actually become a little bit more optimistic as the year has gone on about that. I did think that was a valid sort of thing to say. I mean, can you imagine Sydney without the Herald? And I think there was a period, a year and a half ago, that some people actually dared to imagine that. And that is a really frightening thing. And I think there was a bit of a groundswell of people. I mean, this talk isn't about the Herald, as I say. I mean, I probably could say the same thing. Can you imagine Sydney without the Daily Telegraph? You can cheer now if you want, I don't mind. So I think we've got to get smart about it. We've got to be really clear about what the objectives of any pro-am type of arrangement is. And we need to devote resources to it at our end as well, because it is, as you know from your own work, resource heavy.
Yes, I'm actually a curated university student, so I'm not in the category of a lot of the previous speakers. But I'm just wondering, having been a fan for the Herald for quite some time, having had the experience at university of the abstract and the introduction to essays and all this type of thing, one of the biggest problems I find with a lot of the young people is, I think it's called the 32nd grade or something like that. And a lot of the young people are not let in. And I really find it disappointing for the Herald and some of this type of thing. The headlines sometimes don't mean very much, but there is none of this condensed lead in to want to make you read the articles. Perhaps the review section of the Friday Financial Review can do it sometimes, but I want to encourage the younger people to want to go into the depth of the articles. And I'm sorry, but I really find that it probably is a special skill, but I think it's missing.
So we failed. No, we are failing, is what you're saying.
I think you could do better.
Well, I'll take that as a comment, and I you know, I'm not going to argue with you because we can always do better. I agree.
Okay.
Stephen, you ran. Oh.
Sorry, you've had a question. I'm sorry, mate. We've hit the time. Yes, Arthur would be fantastic.
Right,
So, thanks, Peter. My final comments then is to give thanks to you. One of the functions of a university is to make a contribution to knowledge, and when I think of an original contribution to knowledge, and when I think of the work you've done with the Sydney Democracy Initiative, with the WikiLeaks hosting, with the Roundtable on Editing, with the department, you've certainly made, and tonight, I think you've done a great job and have contributed to that effort greatly, so thank you. So if you could give a round.